I acted poor at Christmas dinner with my boyfriend's parents. Their charity gift exposed everything. My name is Lena Parker, I'm 31, and I work as a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized tech company in Seattle. This morning, the city was wrapped in a thin layer of winter mist, Christmas lights blinking softly against the gray sky, as I stepped off the bus and walked toward my tiny apartment with coffee warming my hands. To anyone passing by, I looked like the kind of woman who lived paycheck to paycheck: old boots, a thrift store coat, hair tied back in a simple knot. No one would ever guess that I actually own 3 rental homes across the city. Not even my boyfriend, Ethan. He thinks I'm surviving on a modest salary, budgeting every dollar, barely keeping up with rent. I never corrected him. I wanted to be seen for who I am, not what I have. So, when he invited me to Christmas Eve dinner with his parents, warning gently that they care a lot about appearances, a quiet curiosity sparked inside me. I wanted to see how they'd treat a poor girl. But the moment the gifts were opened, everything changed. Tell me, have you ever hidden a part of yourself just to see how someone would react? I didn't grow up in a city of glass towers and coffee shops on every corner. My story began far from Seattle, in a quiet working-class town tucked between 2 low, pine-covered hills, one of those places where everyone knows the sound of everyone else's truck, where neighbors borrow sugar without knocking, and where Saturday mornings smell like wood smoke and cheap diner pancakes. My father was a handyman, the kind of man who could fix anything except his own exhaustion. My mother worked the checkout lane at the local grocery store for most of my childhood and later took a job as a part-time teaching aide at the elementary school. We didn't have much. Some months, when the winter bills hit harder than expected, we barely had enough. But in that small, drafty house at the edge of town, I learned what real wealth looks like long before I ever touched a spreadsheet. My earliest memories are of my father coming home with cold hands and sawdust in his hair, dropping onto the sagging sofa with a tired smile that somehow always found its way to me. He never complained, not about long hours, not about aching knees, not even about clients who paid late or paid less. Hard work isn't everything, he used to say, but it teaches you who you are. My mother, on the other hand, carried kindness the way some people carried jewelry: quietly, naturally, like it belonged to her. She always left an extra chair at the dinner table, just in case someone dropped by. And people did drop by. A neighbor who'd lost his job, a cousin whose wife had left him, a kid from down the street who needed somewhere warm to sit until his parents stopped fighting. We didn't have much food, yet somehow there was always enough to share. My parents never said the word integrity out loud. They didn't have to. They lived it in the way they treated people: freely, without conditions, without measuring anyone's worth by the size of their wallet. One evening, when I was 9, I remember asking my mother why she gave half of her holiday bonus to Mrs. Harper, the elderly widow who lived 3 houses down. Mom shrugged, stirring a pot of soup as if the answer were obvious. Because she needed it more than we did, she said softly. And because kindness isn't something you give only when you can afford it. That night, sitting on my creaky little bed with a worn blanket pulled to my chin, I realized something that has never left me. You don't have to be rich to live richly. You just have to give more than you take, and stand by your word even when it costs you. Growing up, money was always the shadow in the room, never discussed directly, but always there, shaping our choices. My father kept envelopes in the kitchen drawer, labeled rent, utilities, and emergencies, each one thin, bending at the corners. When I turned 15, he handed me one of the envelopes: grocery fund, and said, "This is yours now. Learn to stretch a dollar until it sings." I laughed, but I took it seriously. Those early lessons in budgeting didn't come from textbooks or financial seminars. They came from counting coins at a kitchen table with chipped edges, from choosing between new shoes or school supplies, from learning that dignity isn't something poverty can take away unless you let it. When I reached high school, people around me began talking about college, the way some people talk about winning the lottery, something that happened to other people, somewhere else. My father told me I should dream anyway. My mother told me I should apply anyway. And I did. I applied for every scholarship I could find, big or small, writing essays late into the night at a borrowed computer in the school library. When the acceptance letter came with a full scholarship attached, I cried in the hallway before I even made it to the parking lot. My father hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe, and my mother called every relative she had ever met. To them, it wasn't just my scholarship. It was a door they'd spent their whole lives knocking on. College was the opposite of home: loud, fast, expensive. I lived in the cheapest dorm on campus, a rectangular box with peeling paint and a heater that rattled every time the temperature dropped below freezing. I ate instant noodles, saved every receipt, and worked 2 campus jobs, shelving books in the library and wiping down tables in the student cafe. I watched classmates buy things without checking price tags, and for a long time, I felt like I was made of different material, heavier, rougher, stitched together by necessity instead of choice. But I didn't resent them. If anything, I observed them the way an anthropologist observes another species. That's where I learned that wealth and character often walk separate roads. Some of the wealthiest students were the loneliest. Some of the poorest were the most generous. And I decided, quietly and firmly, that whatever kind of adult I became, I would never let money decide the kind of person I was. After graduation, I took the first job I was offered: a junior accounting position at a small logistics company. The office was cramped, the computers outdated, and the break room coffee tasted like burnt cardboard. But that little company taught me how businesses breathe from the inside. I learned to decipher financial statements the way some people read sheet music. I learned to solve problems without waiting for permission. And I learned something that shaped the rest of my life. Money doesn't grow by accident, it grows by discipline. It grows by patience. It grows when you stop trying to look rich and instead learn how to build stability, brick by brick, quietly, consistently, without applause. Those early years were not glamorous, but they were honest. And honesty, I've learned, is the strongest foundation one can build a life on. My childhood taught me many things, but perhaps the lesson that shaped me most was the constant, silent fear of losing our home. I still remember the way my mother's fingers would tap nervously on the kitchen table whenever rent was due, how my father's voice would tighten when an unexpected repair bill arrived, and how the word landlord always carried a power that hovered above us, like weather we couldn't control. While other kids dreamed about cars or clothes or vacations, I dreamed about stability. The kind of stability that doesn't vanish when someone else changes their mind or raises the rent. So, long before I graduated college, I made a quiet promise to myself. One day, I would own something no one could take away. And maybe, if I was lucky, I would own enough to help someone who grew up the way I did. I didn't choose real estate out of ambition. I chose it out of memory. Out of watching my parents work too hard for too little and still worry every month. Out of wanting to build a life where no child of mine would ever have to overhear the whispered question, "Can we afford to stay?" That fear settled into me like a seed, and by the time I was in my 20s, it had sprouted into a kind of hunger not for wealth, but for safety. My first few years after college were nothing special. I earned barely enough to cover rent, student expenses, and the occasional indulgence of a grocery store bouquet to brighten my cramped, little studio. But I worked hard, I tracked every dollar. I took on overtime whenever it was offered. And when that still wasn't enough, I picked up small side jobs organizing tax documents for family, friends, babysitting on weekends, tutoring high school students in math. I wasn't trying to get rich. I was trying to build a foundation thick enough to stand on. When I turned 25, I hit my first milestone, $18,000 saved. It wasn't much by most standards, but to me it felt like a mountain's 6 years of sacrifice stacked inside a single number. I remember sitting on the floor of my apartment one night, the glow of my laptop lighting the pages of a cheap notebook filled with columns of rent prices and mortgage rates. That was the night I typed "foreclosed homes outside Seattle" into a search bar and stumbled onto the listing that would change everything: a 2-bedroom fixer-upper on the outskirts of Tacoma. The roof was sagging, the paint was peeling, and the previous tenants had abandoned it mid-renovation. But the price was low, shockingly low. Low enough that my hands shook a little as I did the math. I visited the house on a rainy Saturday morning. The front steps creaked like they were whispering secrets, and the living room smelled faintly of mildew and dust. My boots left marks on the unpolished floor as I walked from room to room. Most people would have turned around, dismissed it as a money pit, and walked away. But I didn't see rot or ruin. I saw walls waiting to be repaired, a kitchen waiting to be rebuilt, and a chance, my first real chance, to turn fear into something solid. My father drove up from my hometown to look at it with me. He ran his calloused fingers along the cracked window frames and smiled through the rain. "It's ugly," he said, "but it's yours if you want it. And I can help you fix the bones." It's fast 5:30. 2 weeks later, I signed the papers. I cried on the bus ride home, not from joy or fear, but from the strange, electric feeling of stepping into a version of myself I had only ever imagined. The first house taught me patience. I spent evenings covered in paint, weekends scraping old tile, and nights learning plumbing through online tutorials that buffered every 5 minutes. When it was finally livable, I rented it to a young couple who had just moved from out of state. They treated the home with care, paid rent on time, and once left a thank you card on the porch that simply said, "Thank you for believing in us." That small gesture made every scraped knuckle worth it. And when the rent payments began to come in, steady and quiet, I felt something shift inside me. Passive income was no longer just a concept, it was a pathway. At 27, after a promotion at work and months of strict budgeting, I refinanced the Tacoma home and used the equity to put a down payment on a second property, a modest duplex in Kent. This one didn't need as much fixing, but it taught me something different: how to manage tenants, how to negotiate repairs, how to hold my ground with contractors who assumed my quiet voice meant inexperience. It took time, effort, and learning to say no without apologizing. But the duplex became my second anchor. The third home came when I turned 30, after another raise and a series of bonuses from projects I had poured every ounce of energy into. This one was my favorite, a small townhouse in a well-kept neighborhood just east of the city. The streets were lined with maple trees that turned golden in autumn, and neighbors decorated their porches with matching wreaths during the holidays. It was calm, safe, quiet, and unknowingly. It sat only a few blocks away from a place that would later matter far more than I expected. With 3 homes, my financial life changed. Not in a glamorous way, no luxury cars, no designer clothes, no rooftop apartment overlooking the skyline. Instead, it changed in the way my breath eased each morning, in the way fear loosened its grip around my ribs, in the way I could send a check to my parents without them knowing it came from sacrifice. But even with 3 properties under my name, I still chose to live in a small rented apartment, the kind with thin walls and a window that fogged every winter morning. People sometimes assume that when someone climbs the ladder, they want the world to see it. But I didn't. I never wanted my value to be measured by granite countertops or hardwood floors. I want people to see me. I once told my mother, not my portfolio. And pretty actions. If buying my third townhouse marked a quiet turning point in my financial life, then meeting Ethan marked a turning point in the part of my life that money could never touch. It happened during a cold December morning 2 years ago, the kind where the wind slices through even the warmest coats and people walk with their shoulders hunched, breath fogging in the air like ghosts trailing behind them. I had stopped at a small cafe near my office, a place known for oversteamed lattes and stale pastries, but blessed with one thing I desperately needed that morning: a working outlet. My laptop battery was dead, and I had a report due before noon. The cafe was packed with holiday shoppers taking refuge from the cold, children tugging at mittened hands, Christmas music humming softly in the background. I found the last open seat near a wobbly table, dropped my bag, and plugged in my laptop just as someone behind me bumped my chair. When I turned around, I saw him tall, wrapped in a navy coat dusted with snowflakes, eyes soft and apologetic. "I'm so sorry," he said, hands raised slightly as if approaching a startled animal. "That stroller drove me right into you." I glanced past him and saw a flustered couple maneuvering a stroller the size of a small car. I laughed. "You're forgiven," I said, scooting my chair in. "Not your fault." He smiled, the kind of smile that rose all the way to his eyes. "I'm Ethan." That was it. No pickup line, no exaggerated charm, just a simple introduction from a man who looked both confident and kind, which is a rare combination to find in a coffee shop during holiday season chaos. We made small talk between sips of lukewarm coffee, and when he noticed I was working, he didn't hover or try to impress me. Instead, he asked what I was reading, what music I liked, what podcasts I listened to during my commute. Not once did he ask what I earned or where I lived. Not once did he evaluate me the way people often do in this city, scanning for labels, for signals, for clues of status. That first conversation stretched into a second one a week later at a co-working event, then into a third at a weekend class we both happened to sign up for on a whim, creative thinking for data professionals. By the time he asked me out for dinner, it felt less like meeting someone new and more like finding someone familiar in a place I hadn't expected. Ethan was steady in a way that made you feel like the room calmed when you walked in. He wasn't loud or arrogant or restless. He asked good questions. He actually listened. But as I got to know him better, I began to notice something underneath his calmness, a faint, quiet tension, like a string pulled just a little too tight. I first sensed it the night he was supposed to meet me at a small ramen shop near my apartment. He arrived late, apologizing with that same gentle smile. But I noticed the way he checked his phone 3 times during dinner. When I asked if everything was okay, he exhaled slowly and said, "My mom's just particular. She wants to know everything I'm doing." Everything. Over the next few months, I learned more about the world Ethan came from, one very different from mine. His family lived in a gated suburb north of the city, where lawns were manicured by professional crews and houses were decorated with coordinated Christmas lights that reappeared every year with military precision. His father, Richard, was a high-profile corporate attorney. His mother, Elaine, was an event planner for luxury holiday galas, the kind that raised money for charity while serving dinners costing more than my monthly grocery budget. They weren't bad people, not exactly. But they belonged to a world where expectations were woven into every conversation, where reputation mattered almost as much as affection, where every family dinner felt like a performance graded silently from across the table. Ethan once told me, in a moment of unguarded honesty, growing up, I always felt like I had to be perfect. Like one wrong move and everything would collapse. Collapse? I asked. He shrugged, not literally. But I saw the way my parents reacted when things didn't go their way, how they tightened, how they whispered, "There's a right way to live," in their eyes. A right job, a right partner. A right version of the future. And the pressure to get it right. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The weight of it hung in the space between us. That was the moment I understood the tiny shadow behind his smile. Ethan wasn't afraid of failing, he was afraid of disappointing people who confused image with worth. People who, as I would later learn firsthand, measured others by the sharpness of their clothes or the shine of their careers. And maybe that was part of the reason I didn't tell him about the houses. Maybe it was unfair, maybe I should have trusted him sooner. But I had spent years building my financial life brick by quiet brick, with no applause, no audience, no need to display anything. I didn't want to become a version of myself filtered through someone else's expectations. And I needed to know deep in my bones that Ethan liked me for who I was on those quiet mornings with my thrift store coat and grocery store coffee. So when he once asked casually, "Where do you live? Is it close to downtown?" I simply said, "I rent a small place. I get by. I'm fine." And it was true in its own way. I did rent a small place, and I did get by. I just didn't add the rest. I didn't tell him about the townhouse with the maple trees. I didn't tell him about the duplex or the Tacoma home that had become my first real victory. I didn't tell him about the tenants who sent me holiday cards or the spreadsheets I updated late at night to track mortgages and maintenance expenses. I kept all of that tucked quietly behind the version of myself I chose to show, a version unburdened by assumptions, free from the scrutiny I had watched wealthy families inflict on one another. I wanted love to grow on neutral ground, not on numbers, not on assets, not on the silent calculation of what I could offer someone's future. The first real warning sign arrived on a quiet Wednesday evening in early December, a few weeks before Christmas Eve. I was chopping vegetables in my tiny kitchen, really just a narrow strip of counter by the sink, when my phone lit up with Ethan's name. I answered with a smile, expecting his usual warmth, but instead I heard a slightly strained pause before he said, "Hey, my mom wants to talk to you. Is now okay?" I froze for a second. the knife hovering above a half-cut carrot. Your mom? She insisted, he whispered, as if lowering his voice could soften whatever was coming next. Before I could respond, another voice came through smooth, practiced, the kind of tone you hear from someone who's spent years hosting charity galas and directing photographers. Hello, Lena dear. This is Elaine, Ethan's mother. I straightened instinctively, even though she couldn't see me. Hi, Mrs. Bennett. It's nice to. So, she cut in lightly, Ethan tells us you two have been spending quite a bit of time together. It's statement, Her voice had a way of sounding both sweet and sharp at the same time, like a compliment carved into glass. Yes, I said, keeping my tone warm. He's wonderful. I'm really happy we met. A pause, polite but assessing. Tell me, what do you do for work? I'm a senior financial analyst. Oh. Lovely, she replied, though the enthusiasm felt slightly too bright, too performative. And, where do you live? Are you in the downtown area? I felt her sorting me into categories, the way people from her world often do puzzles that can be solved with the right labels. I kept my answer simple. I rent a small apartment, a little north of the city. Still paying off some things. But I manage. Silence. Not long, but long enough to identify exactly what she was thinking. Of course, she said finally, her voice taking on that soft, sympathetic tone people use when they believe you're struggling. People your age often do. The economy is challenging. Another pause, then the subtle shift that made my chest tighten a little. If you ever need budgeting advice, dear, we'd be happy to help. There it was, the assumption. Not born from malice, at least not in her mind, but from a deeply rooted belief that worth could be measured by ease, by comfort, by how insulated someone was from life's uncertainties. I pressed my lips together before answering. Thank you. I'll keep that in mind. It's good, she added, almost casually, that Ethan has finally found a girl who isn't chasing money. Far too many young women see him as an opportunity. I stood still, the refrigerator humming loudly behind me. Ethan, blessing his heart, murmured in the background. Mom. But Elaine continued, unfazed. You sound different. Grounded, simple, it's refreshing. Grounded, simple. I knew what she meant. I knew precisely which box she had placed me into, the humble, sweet girl who doesn't have much and therefore must be grateful for whatever she receives. And for a moment, I felt that old familiar sting. The one I thought I had outgrown, the sting of being judged through the filter of appearance, a stranger's first impression calcifying into a conclusion they would never question again. That feeling pulled me backward into a memory I had buried for years. A job interview right out of college, when my only pair of black flats had a faint scuff on the toe. I remembered sitting in a leathery office chair while the hiring manager's eyes flicked down to my shoes, lingering just long enough for me to feel it. Before he said with a thin smile, "We expect a certain level of polish here." I didn't get the job. Not because I lacked skills, my test scores were the highest of all candidates, but because someone with shiny heels walked in after me. Back then, it had taken all my strength not to cry on the bus ride home. That day taught me something I had never forgotten. Some people look at what you wear and think they're seeing who you are. So, standing in my small kitchen now, listening to Elaine describe me as refreshing, in the way people sometimes describe thrift stores or old-fashioned manners, I understood exactly what was happening. She wasn't talking to me, she was talking to the version of me she had invented in her head, shaped entirely from the handful of sentences I'd offered. When the call ended, Ethan apologized 3 different times. They're just very focused on status, he said quietly. They want me to marry someone compatible. He looked ashamed even saying it. Compatible how? I asked, though I already knew. He rubbed the back of his neck, his nervous habit. Same class. Same background. Same expectations. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I understood the weight he carried. The pressure to satisfy a family that judged before they understood, the constant fear of disappointing people who believed they knew what was best for him. I didn't blame him. I didn't even blame them, really. People repeat what they were raised with. But hearing it, being placed into that simple girl narrative. It struck something deep inside me, something that simmered quietly beneath the surface. I didn't correct them. I didn't tell Elaine that the small apartment she imagined was only a choice, not a sentence. I didn't tell her about the spreadsheets color-coded with mortgage tracking, or the 3 properties gaining equity every month. I didn't tell her that part of the reason I manage so well is because I'd built a life sturdy enough to stand even if my job disappeared tomorrow. I stayed quiet because some truths deserve the right moment to be revealed. And, though I didn't know it then, Christmas Eve surrounded by stockings, garlands, and the soft crackle of wrapping paper would become that moment. Not because I wanted to impress them. Not because I needed validation. But because sometimes the universe chooses a night wrapped in lights and glitter and holiday cheer to peel back illusions and show people exactly what they failed to see. And Elaine, so certain of who I was based on a few harmless sentences, was about to learn that appearances can be the most misleading currency of all. Ethan invited me 3 days after that uncomfortable phone call. We were walking through Pike Place, the air crisp with December cold, the smell of roasted chestnuts drifting between the stalls. Christmas lights hung above us in warm strands, turning the evening into something soft and golden. Ethan slipped his hands into his coat pockets, the way he always did when he was nervous. "So, my parents want you to come to Christmas Eve dinner. Gift exchange, the whole thing. Mom said she wants to meet you properly this time." Properly. The word lingered like an echo I wasn't sure how to interpret. I smiled softly, though something inside me tugged with hesitation. "Christmas Eve? That's important for your family, right?" He nodded quickly, stepping closer. "Yeah. But I want you there, I mean it." I believed him. Ethan wasn't the problem, he never had been. It was the world he came from. The expectations, the polished walls of appearances his parents had constructed so carefully. That night, after Ethan dropped me off and I climbed the stairs to my small apartment, I stood in the quiet living room with the lights off, looking at the faint glow from the street below. I felt the question rise again, the same one I had pushed away so many times. Should I tell him? Should I finally say, "Ethan, I own 3 rental homes"? Should I tell him the truth before walking into a room full of people who thought of me as a humble little girl with only a thrift store coat to her name? I sat on the edge of my bed, the noise of distant carols floating up from the street, and let the thought settle. If I told him now, the entire dynamic would shift. He would carry that knowledge into Christmas Eve, softened by it, protected by it. His parents would greet me differently, not with authentic reactions, but with filtered politeness born of revised assumptions. A sanitized version of acceptance. No, that wasn't what I wanted. "I want to see how they'd treat a girl they think is barely getting by," I whispered to myself, the words settling like frost on a windowpane. Not out of malice. Not to trap them. But to see the truth. To see who they were when no advantage could be gained by being kind. Once I made the decision, the rest happened in a quiet, steady flow. On Christmas Eve morning, I opened my wardrobe. I had options: silk blouses, dresses I'd worn to corporate galas, a camel coat that cost more than most people's rent. I could present myself the way my bank account allowed. But that wasn't the point of this experiment. So, instead, I reached for the pieces that told a different story. A story they would believe. A soft, slightly pilled sweater I'd owned since college. Jeans faded from years of wear. A pair of leather boots with scuffed toes that had carried me through rainy mornings and long walks home. And the second-hand coat I'd bought during my first winter in Seattle, the one with a missing button I never bothered to replace. I put them on and stood in front of the mirror. I didn't look poor. I didn't look wealthy. I looked like any ordinary woman who was doing her best to get by in an expensive city. Exactly what they expected. Exactly what I needed them to see. I tied my hair back in a simple low ponytail, dabbed on minimal makeup, just enough mascara to keep my eyes from disappearing under the holiday lights. No jewelry except small silver studs. Then came the gifts. I sat at my tiny dining table and began wrapping them. The surface gifts, the ones they would judge first. A tin of assorted cookies I had repackaged by hand into simple brown paper, tied with thin twine. A glass vase I found in a discount bin, wrapped in white tissue paper. A knitted scarf, simple, gray wool, soft, cozy, handcrafted, the kind of thing people either appreciate deeply or dismiss as sweet but humble. But these were only the outer gifts. The real ones were tucked into a small envelope I slipped into my bag, sealed with a snowflake sticker. Inside were 3 printed documents. Not the deeds themselves, I had no intention of flaunting them, but photocopies of the most recent property management reports for my 3 homes. They weren't flashy, just spreadsheets and confirmation letters. But they were undeniable. Beside them, I added something else, a small handwritten card. On it, I wrote, "Not all gifts are wrapped. Some are shared when the moment is right. One televis comes," and behind that card, the final piece. A voucher I had created myself, 1 month of free rent for a tenant family who had been struggling. I had been planning to give it quietly before New Year's, but something told me this might be the right moment to reveal it. A reminder that wealth wasn't the point, what you do with it is. As I sealed the envelope, I felt a steady calm wash over me. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't pride. This was clarity. A chance to see the truth wrapped inside the glitter of Christmas lights and red ribbons. That evening, as I stepped out into the cold, the wind carried the scent of pine and snow. My boots crunched lightly on the sidewalk as I locked my door behind me and headed toward Ethan's car waiting below. He looked at me with warmth in his eyes, completely unaware of the quiet storm I carried in my bag. "Ready?" he asked. I smiled, not from nerves but from certainty. "Yes," I said. "More than you know." The drive to Ethan's parents' house took us farther and farther from the city, past rows of elegant homes outlined in warm white Christmas lights. The kind of neighborhood where SUVs gleamed in driveways, wreaths hung from every window, and every front lawn looked curated by professional landscapers. By the time we turned onto his parents' street, the entire suburb looked like a scene from a luxury holiday commercial, snow resting perfectly on trimmed hedges, golden lights dripping from rooftops, and giant, glowing reindeer posed proudly on immaculate lawns. Ethan parked in front of a 2-story colonial home wrapped in garland and sparkling like a postcard. A 30-foot Christmas tree was visible through the tall living room windows, ornaments reflecting amber light. I stepped out of the car, clutching my modestly wrapped gifts, suddenly feeling the sharp contrast between the world I came from and the one I was entering. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon and pine. The walls were adorned with framed family portraits, Ethan in private school uniforms, Ethan at ski resorts, Ethan in tailored suits at his father's awards dinners. Every surface gleamed. Everything screamed stability, wealth, legacy. Richard Bennett, his father, appeared first. Tall, silver hair perfectly brushed, wearing a deep burgundy sweater that probably cost more than my entire outfit. He extended his hand, firm and authoritative, the kind of handshake that silently establishes hierarchy. "Lena, good to finally meet you." I shook his hand, offering a warm smile. "Thank you for having me." He nodded, but his eyes flicked briefly to my boots, noting the scuffs with polite discretion. Then came Elaine. She looked exactly like the voice I'd heard over the phone, elegant, slim, blonde hair curled perfectly, pearl earrings glinting beneath the warm lights. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that measured as much as it welcomed. Her gaze slid from my coat to my jeans, to the brown paper-wrapped gifts in my hands. "Oh, sweetheart," she said in that soft, gracious tone that somehow made you feel smaller. "You didn't have to bring anything. I know how tight budgets are these days. Is not was no stands, is next duns." The words floated out like innocent snowflakes, but each one landed with a sting. "I wanted to," I replied gently. "Well, that's very thoughtful." Her eyes lingered on the twine-wrapped cookie tin. "Very sweet." We moved into the living room. The Christmas tree towered above us, surrounded by piles of beautifully wrapped gifts, silver paper, velvet ribbons, tags embossed with gold calligraphy. Mine, in contrast, looked like something from a thrift shop holiday fair. Ethan squeezed my hand, noticing my silence. "It'll be fine," he whispered. Dinner was served shortly after: roast beef, glazed carrots, scalloped potatoes arranged like something you'd see in a holiday magazine spread. I sat beside Ethan, across from his parents, pretending not to notice the glances exchanged between them every time I answered a question modestly. "So, Lena," Richard began as he passed the gravy boat, "Ethan tells us you rent a small place in the city." "Yes," I said, smiling lightly. "It's cozy. I like it." He nodded with a sympathetic hum. "I suppose it's hard to get ahead when rent keeps rising." "It is challenging," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Elaine chimed in gracefully. "Oh, Richard, don't depress the poor girl. I'm sure she works very, very hard just to keep up with her bills." She smiled at me with an almost maternal gentleness, one that didn't comfort but rather suffocated. My fork paused midair. Ethan tried to interject. "Mom, that's..." But she continued effortlessly. "I just hope you're not depending on Ryan too much financially. He's always been very generous." I felt something tighten in my chest, a small ache that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite sadness, more like the quiet sting of being underestimated so completely. "I'm quite independent," I said softly. "Oh, of course," she replied automatically, with the tone of someone who didn't believe a word but wanted to appear polite. "It's just important that he finds a partner who understands stability." Stability. There it was again. That word people from her world used like a velvet-coated weapon. Dinner continued with conversations about real estate ironically. Richard proudly discussed their investment properties, the way interest rates were affecting market demand. Elaine described a bidding war on a home in their neighborhood. They spoke the language of ownership with ease, privilege woven through every sentence. I sat quietly, nodding, pretending to be just a renter, barely understanding their world, while in my mind I could see spreadsheets of my own properties. Calculate net yield. Think about long-term appreciation curves. But I said nothing. Not yet. That wasn't the purpose of this night. Elaine took a sip of wine and added casually, "It's just funny, isn't it? People renting these days pay almost the same as a mortgage. But I suppose not everyone is ready for that responsibility." I smiled faintly. "I guess not." Another micro-smile from her, gentle, pitying, perfectly sharpened. "It's admirable that you're doing your best." Ethan's jaw tightened. He reached under the table, holding my hand, but his grip was weak, not protective, not assertive, just worried. That hurt more than anything his parents had said. He wasn't standing with me. Not yet. And maybe he didn't even know how. I kept my expression soft and unbothered, but inside, a small valley opened, quiet disappointment settling like cold snow. Not enough to break me, just enough to chill the space between my ribs. Dinner dragged on with stories from their world ski trips, charity galas, art auctions. I played along, answering politely, smiling when appropriate, even laughing softly when Richard recounted a story about Ethan's disastrous teenage attempt to hang Christmas lights. But every now and then, a small comment slipped through, gentle, subtle, and shaped perfectly to look harmless. "We're so glad Ryan finally found someone down to earth. I have tendon. It's refreshing to meet a girl who isn't overly ambitious. I hope you don't feel overwhelmed by our lifestyle, dear." Each one was a tiny cut, disguised as courtesy. A quiet reminder of my supposed place at the table. Ethan tried to change the subject several times, but his attempts scattered weakly, like sparks dying on snow. He wasn't ready to confront them. And a part of me understood old habits, old fears, old expectations. Still, the ache settled deeper. Valley Hashon. The first real descent. Not dramatic, not loud, just a soft, sinking feeling that reminded me why I had started this experiment in the first place. To see who they were. And to see who Ethan would choose to be. Little did they know, the real turning point would arrive not at the dinner table, but beneath the Christmas tree, when the gifts were opened, and the facade they believed in would begin to crack. But that moment was still waiting beneath glittering paper and golden ribbons. After dinner, everyone moved into the living room. The fireplace crackled softly, and the towering Christmas tree glowed with hundreds of golden lights. Beneath it lay a mountain of presents, designer bags with satin ribbons, gift boxes embossed with luxury brand logos, envelopes tucked into velvet pouches. The whole scene looked like the cover of a magazine aimed at people who never had to worry about heating bills or student loans. I sat beside Ethan on the sofa, my modest gifts resting quietly on the floor near my feet, wrapped in brown paper and tied with thin twine. They looked like they'd wandered into the wrong house. Elaine clapped her hands together, smiling brightly. "Shall we begin?" she said, as though she were hosting a televised holiday special. Her nails sparkled under the lights as she bent down to pick up the first gift, a rectangular box wrapped in deep blue paper. She handed it to Ethan. "For you, darling." He unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a sleek designer jacket, Italian leather, deep mahogany. The kind you see on upscale winter ads with price tags that make your stomach drop. "Mom." "Wow. This is incredible," he murmured. "That's not all," Richard added, handing him another box. A new smartwatch, top of the line, still gleaming with its factory seal. Ethan looked overwhelmed, grateful, yet also slightly embarrassed, glancing at me as if silently apologizing for the extravagance. I just smiled softly, pretending I felt nothing. Next came presents for Ethan's older sister, Clara. A luxury handbag in a shade of winter cream, followed by an envelope containing a printed itinerary for a weekend spa retreat. Clara beamed like a child in a toy store. "You guys really outdid yourselves." Depict. Laughter, clinking of glasses, murmurs of approval filled the room. Every gift was expensive, intentional, deeply rooted in their ritual of proving love through price tags. I watched it all with quiet detachment, feeling like a tourist observing a long-standing tradition in a foreign country. And then, finally, Elaine reached for a small, thin box wrapped in red foil paper. She looked at me with a gentle smile that seemed almost charitable. "Lena, sweetheart," she said, her tone dripping with delicate pity, "this one's for you." I accepted it with a polite nod. It felt unbelievably light in my hands, almost hollow. I peeled back the foil carefully, feeling every pair of eyes in the room watching me. Inside was a book, a paperback titled, "Budgeting for Broke Millennials. How to Stretch Every Dollar." Beneath it lay a cheap pastel-colored financial planner, the kind sold near grocery store checkout counters. And tucked into the planner was a white envelope. Elaine touched my arm lightly. "Open it, dear." I slid out a crisp stack of bills, $200 neatly folded, held together by a gold paperclip. Elaine clasped her hands as though she had performed some kind of noble act. "We know things are tight," she said delicately, her voice coated in sugary concern. "Think of this as a little safety net, just a bit of help so you're not struggling too much while dating our son. It's a since-estimated ride." My breath caught in my throat, but I didn't let it show. She continued, smiling even more warmly. "We just want to make sure you're stable enough that you're not depending too much on him." Richard added with a chuckle, "And we certainly wouldn't want anyone after Ryan for his future security, right?" There it was. The insult wrapped inside a bow. The implication so sharp it sliced straight into my chest. The room hummed with soft laughter, polite nods, murmured approval as though this gesture was the height of generosity. Ethan said nothing. He didn't defend me. He didn't even shift uncomfortably. He just stared at the floor, as if hoping the moment would pass on its own. And that not the money, not the book, not even the assumption was what hurt the most. Valley Hashtu. The deepest plunge, cold and hollow. I set the book down gently. "Thank you," I said quietly. Because anything else would have broken the fragile shell of civility surrounding the room. Elaine beamed, satisfied. Richard nodded approvingly. Clara already moved on, opening her next beautifully wrapped box. I took a breath, steadying myself. Then I reached down and picked up the modest gifts I'd brought, a cookie tin wrapped in brown paper, the knitted scarf. "It's my turn," I said softly. Elaine's smile turned almost indulgent, as though she were bracing herself for something adorably humble. "Oh, sweetheart, you really didn't have to." "I wanted to," I replied, handing her the cookie tin first. She unwrapped it quickly. "Oh, how thoughtful," she said, though her eyes flickered with the faint disappointment of someone who had hoped for more. Richard received the knitted scarf next, gray wool, simple, warm. "How cozy," he said, polite and distant. To them, these gifts were cheap but cute, the kind of thing you keep out of guilt, not out of gratitude. But then I reached into my bag again. My fingers brushed the envelopes, the real gifts. The ones that would shift the air in the room. I actually have something else for each of you, I said, handing the first envelope to Elaine, then to Richard, then to Clara. Something a little more personal. Elaine raised an eyebrow, curiosity lifting her expression. The envelopes were thin, unassuming white paper sealed with simple snowflake stickers. "What's this?" she asked lightly. "Something I wanted to give you all," I replied, my voice calm. My heartbeat steady. Around me, the room fell quiet, not tense yet, but expectant. They were waiting for something sentimental, maybe a handwritten poem or a heartfelt letter. Something appropriately modest for someone like me. Instead, they were holding the opening thread to a truth none of them had even imagined. Under the glow of the Christmas tree, wrapping papers strewn around us like fallen leaves, they lifted the flaps of those envelopes completely unaware that the world they thought they controlled was about to tilt. And the moment they looked inside, everything shifted. For a moment, the room felt perfectly still, as if even the golden lights on the Christmas tree paused their flicker. Elaine held the envelope delicately, her manicured nails tapping the edge as she slid out the papers. Richard leaned slightly forward, curiosity pulling his brows together. Clara glanced between them, already expecting something sentimental, a handwritten message, perhaps a charity card, something appropriately humble. But when Elaine finally unfolded the first sheet, her expression shifted so quickly it could have cracked porcelain. It wasn't a poem. It wasn't a thank you letter. It was a scan of a property deed. A deed with my name printed neatly at the top. And the address, oh, the address was unmistakable. A townhouse on Willowberry Lane. The same street they lived on. The very block they bragged about during dinner. Her eyes darted to the second sheet, a management statement from a property company, showing rental income projections, maintenance notes, and a small holiday discount I had personally approved for the tenant, a single father with 2 kids who had been struggling after unexpected medical bills. On the bottom corner, in my handwriting, a small contribution to the neighborhood. Merry Christmas. Elaine's fingers trembled. She looked at me, then at the page, then back at me as if her brain refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. You own this?" she whispered, her voice thin as tissue paper. Richard grabbed the paper from her hand, scanning it with a sudden sharpness, the same intensity he probably used in courtrooms or negotiation rooms. He flipped to the second envelope, the one he'd been given, and slid out another set of papers. A financial statement from my LLC. Ownership records. 3 properties listed under my name. His jaw tightened. "So you're a landlord?" he said slowly, like each word weighed more than the one before it. His eyes lifted to mine. "How many properties exactly?" 3, I said calmly. "Bought them over time. Old houses, mostly. Fixer-uppers. Nothing extravagant." Elaine blinked rapidly, color draining from her face. I don't understand." "Ethan said you rent a small apartment." "I do." I nodded, by choice. The room went utterly silent. Even the faint hum of the heater seemed to withdraw, giving space to the weight settling between us. I kept my voice soft, steady, nothing dramatic, nothing angry, only the truth. I grew up in a family where money was always tight. We never had security. So I decided, when I got older, that I would build some. Richard swallowed, the facade of certainty slipping. "But why would you live like that if you own 3 homes?" "Because I want people to see me," I said gently. "Not what I have. Not what I could buy, just me." Elaine clutched the deed, her voice cracking. "Then why didn't you say anything?" I met her gaze. And for the first time tonight, I didn't look down or away. "Because you never asked." Elaine inhaled sharply, as if the truth had struck her like cold wind. I continued, voice still steady but sharper now, like a velvet blade. "And when you gave me that book, and the money, you didn't just insult me." Elaine flinched. "You insulted your son as well, assuming he would choose a woman who only wants his wallet." Richard looked away. Clara pressed her lips together. Ethan froze. The humiliation wasn't mine anymore. It shifted, moving like a quiet storm across their perfect living room. I placed the envelope of money on the coffee table gently, pushing it toward Elaine. Maybe, I said softly, you can donate this to a family who truly needs it. I already remember what it feels like to be one of them. It stood on. Elaine stared at the bills, unable to touch them. Richard cleared his throat, trying to gather the pieces of his authority. Why didn't you correct us at dinner? Or earlier? Why let this play out? Because this is who you are when you think I have nothing, I answered simply. And that was something I needed to see clearly. Ethan finally spoke, his voice small. Lena, I turned to him. His face was pale, eyes full of shame. His silence earlier, the quiet shrinking. The way he let his parents speak for him sat between us like a cold shadow. You could have said something, I whispered. Anything. He closed his eyes. I didn't know how. And that, in a strange way, hurt more than anything else tonight. I stood slowly, smoothing my sweater, making sure my voice didn't waver. I'm not angry, I said quietly. Just disappointed. I didn't expect your parents to understand me, but I hoped you would. His action is verted. Elaine reached out slightly, her voice breaking. Lena, dear, please, we never meant. But I held up a hand gently. Not rude, just final. I know what you meant. A soft, sad smile curved at my lips. And I know what you didn't bother to find out. The Christmas lights twinkled behind me as I stepped back, the warmth of the room suddenly suffocating. I picked up my coat, my scarf, the small tin the cookie box had come in. Thank you for dinner, I said with sincerity, not bitterness. And Merry Christmas. Elaine's lips parted as if she wanted to apologize again, but no words came. Richard stared at the envelope on the table as though it were a mirror reflecting something he didn't want to see. Clara looked away, cheeks flushed with secondhand shame. And Ethan? He stood, reaching for my arm, but stopped short, unable to find the right gesture, the right sentence to bridge the gap. Lena, please. Stay. Let's talk. I shook my head. Not tonight. I walked toward the door, each step steady despite the tightness in my chest. Ethan's voice cracked behind me, soft enough that maybe only the Christmas tree truly heard it. I'm so sorry. I paused at the doorway, not turning around, but letting the words settle into the quiet air. Then I stepped outside. The cold winter air hit me like a shock, but also like freedom, crisp, honest, unfiltered. My breath rose in the dark, forming little clouds of warmth that faded into the night. Behind me, through the window, the Bennett family sat frozen in a glittering, perfect room now dimmed by truth. And I walked down the snowy path alone, hurt, yes, but carrying something heavier than humiliation and stronger than pride. My dignity. My self-worth. My choice. Peak#2 wasn't about triumph. It was about reclaiming the part of myself I refused to let anyone diminish even on Christmas Eve. And as the cold wind wrapped around me, I whispered softly into the winter night. I am my own safety net. The cold air outside the Bennett's house wrapped around me like a second skin as I stepped off their porch and into the quiet Christmas Eve night. Snow drifted slowly from the sky, soft and silent, dusting my hair and coat as I walked down the long driveway. Their perfect neighborhood lined with symmetrical trees, glowing reindeer and manicured lawns looked almost unreal in the stillness. Too polished. Too curated. Too hollow now that the illusion had cracked. My boots crunched against the fresh layer of snow. Each breath rose in a small cloud in front of me. And as I walked farther from the Bennett's door, I felt something inside me loosen like a knot that had been pulled too tight for too long finally giving way. I replayed their words in my mind, but they didn't sting the way they did earlier. Not anymore. Not after the reveal. Not after seeing their faces shift from smug benevolence to stunned disbelief. Instead of anger, I felt a deep, steady clarity. A reminder that dignity doesn't come from what people think of you, especially people who never bothered to look beyond the surface. The cold seeped through my sweater, but I kept walking, snow melting on my eyelashes. For a moment, I remembered the younger version of me, the girl who used to work double shifts, whose bank account would dip to its last $20, who'd once been dismissed by a hiring manager because her shoes weren't expensive enough. I remembered how that girl cried in the bathroom at her campus library, wondering if she would ever be taken seriously. And, for the first time in years, I wished I could hug her. Tell her she'd be okay. Tell her she'd own 3 homes one day. Tell her no perfectly decorated Christmas house could take her worth away again. By the time I reached my apartment, my hair was wet, my cheeks numb, my fingers stiff from the cold. But I felt strangely lighter, stripped of the weight of pretending, stripped of fear, stripped of the need to prove anything to anyone. I slept hard that night, exhaustion pulling me under like a wave. It wasn't until late the next morning, Christmas Day, that my phone buzzed repeatedly on the nightstand. Ethan's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. "Lena?" His voice was rough, tired, like he hadn't slept at all. "Yes. I'm so sorry." He took a shaky breath. "Last night after you left, I lost it. I yelled at them, really yelled. I told them they treated the woman I love like a charity case. The woman I love." The words hung in the air, warmer than the sunlight creeping through my curtains. I didn't say anything right away. I could hear him pacing, his breath uneven, the guilt in every inhale. I froze, Lena. I froze like an idiot. His voice cracked. "I've spent my whole life trying not to embarrass them, trying to be the good son, the one who doesn't make waves. And when I finally needed to speak up, I didn't. I'm so ashamed." I exhaled slowly. "Ethan. I know," he cut in gently. "You deserved better." A pause. "And they know it too now." I made sure of that. It is never. I imagined the Bennett's perfect dining room, silent, humiliated, maybe even reflecting, but I didn't cling to the image. I wasn't looking for revenge anymore. I wasn't even angry. A few days later, after the city thawed a little and the holiday haze began to fade, Ethan asked if we could meet. I agreed. We chose a small cafe near Pike Place, nothing fancy, nothing curated. A warm spot with fogged windows, worn wooden tables, and the lingering smell of cinnamon. I arrived early and sat in the corner, watching couples pass by outside bundled in scarves and long coats. Ethan walked in a few minutes later, shoulders tense, eyes searching for me. When he spotted me, his expression softened, almost fragile. "Hi," he murmured as he sat down. "Hi." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't hostile, it was thoughtful, contemplative. Ethan wrapped his hands around his mug, as if grounding himself. "When I was growing up," he began quietly, "the rule was always the same: don't embarrass the family. Don't push back. Don't make them look bad." He gave a humorless laugh. I thought I'd grown out of that. Turns out I hadn't. I listened, watching the way his eyes flickered with shame and honesty. He continued. "When they started talking down to you, I felt myself split. Part of me wanted to fight. But the other part, the one that's been conditioned since I was a kid, just went silent. I didn't realize until last night how much silence can hurt someone." I set my mug down. "Ethan, I never needed you to be perfect. I just needed you to see me." He looked up sharply. And I saw something raw in his expression, fear, regret, but also a desire to grow. "I did see you," he whispered. "I just didn't protect what I saw." My chest tightened, not with hurt, but with something bittersweet. "I also need to admit something," I said softly. "This whole experiment, not correcting them, it wasn't just curiosity." I took a breath. "I've spent so much of my life being afraid someone would love me for the wrong reasons. For money, security, what I could provide. I wanted to know if you'd love me even when you thought I had nothing." His eyes widened, but he didn't interrupt. "I didn't plan for it to go that far," I added. "I didn't expect the gifts, or the humiliation. But I can't pretend I didn't set the stage either." He nodded slowly, absorbing my honesty. "Lena," he said, leaning forward, "I love you for who you are. The woman who buys old houses and fixes them with her own hands. The woman who helps tenants quietly. The woman who walks into a room humble and walks out unchanged by the noise around her." My throat tightened. "And if we move forward," he said gently, "I promise you something, I won't be silent again. Not for them. Not at your expense. Not at mine. It ready tase." I studied him for a long moment, measuring the sincerity in his eyes. He wasn't offering perfection. He was offering growth. "I don't need you to choose me over your family," I finally said, "but I do need you to choose your respect for me, and your respect for yourself. You can't keep prioritizing family harmony over basic decency." He nodded once, firm. "I know. We didn't rush into labels or promises. We didn't wrap it up in a perfect bow like some holiday romance. But as we sat together, watching snow fall outside the cafe windows, something shifted. Not an ending. Not a beginning. But a recalibration, two people meeting in the middle with more honesty, more vulnerability, and more understanding than before. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was exactly what healing looked like. 6 months passed, then almost a year quietly, steadily, like pages turning without fanfare. Life didn't change overnight. I still lived in my same small apartment, still took the bus when I didn't feel like driving, still wore the same thrifted coat on chilly mornings. But something inside me had shifted, a softness, a steadiness. A deeper kind of peace that came not from wealth, not from proving myself, but from no longer hiding who I was. The 3 rental homes were still under my name, still generating income, still filled with tenants. I actually cared about people who reminded me of my parents, of my younger self, of the years I lived paycheck to paycheck, with hope stitched into the hems of my days. But now, every time I reviewed maintenance reports or planned improvements, I felt more purpose than pride. Because somewhere between the humiliation under the Bennett's Christmas tree and the honesty at that cafe, I realized something: wealth meant nothing if I didn't use it well. If it didn't expand into something bigger than me. If it didn't help someone who reminded me of a version of myself that had once struggled alone. That's why I started Her Keys Project, a small, volunteer-run workshop I hosted twice a month in a borrowed community room behind a library. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't a nonprofit with a big logo or corporate sponsors. It was just me and a circle of young women students, single moms, baristas, interns, anyone who wanted to learn how money really worked, how to build credit, how to budget with dignity instead of shame, and maybe, one day, how to buy their first place. The idea was simple. Women deserve financial safety, and no one should grow up believing homeownership is a luxury reserved for the lucky. By the following December, almost exactly 1 year after the Bennett's Christmas dinner, I hosted a special holiday session. The community room was decorated with string lights and little paper ornaments the girls cut out themselves. Someone brought cinnamon rolls. Someone else brought cocoa packets. We crammed around 2 long folding tables, laughing, sharing goals, and adding colorful sticky notes to a board titled, "My First Step Toward My First Key." It's somethings. Near the end of the session, one of the girls, a college sophomore named Mariah, asked if anyone had ever been looked down on for not having money. A ripple of laughter passed through the room, because the answer was obvious. Then she looked directly at me. "Lena, you always seem so calm about money. Like you've never been judged." I hesitated. Then I told them the story. Not with names. Not with wealthy suburbs. Not with a Christmas tree stacked with designer gifts. I told them about a girl who was misjudged because of a thrifted coat. About parents who assumed she needed budgeting help. About a book for broke millennials wrapped as a gift. And about the moment she quietly revealed she was the landlord of one of their street's coveted townhouses. They leaned in, wide-eyed, a mix of shock, delight, and outrage passing over their faces like shifting light. When I finished, Mariah covered her mouth with her hands. "I always thought people like you were born rich," she whispered. "But now I think, maybe I have a shot too." That moment, her words, her hope hit deeper than any Christmas gift I'd ever received. Later that evening, as the group packed up, someone tapped my shoulder. It was a woman with soft brown hair, dressed simply but neatly, holding a small box wrapped in red paper. "I'm Elaine," she said quietly. My breath caught, not out of fear this time, but out of genuine surprise. She handed me the box. "I didn't know if I should come, but I've been attending your sessions anonymously online. I needed to unlearn a lot of things." There was no arrogance in her voice now. No forced sympathy. Just sincerity, raw, almost timid. "I'm sorry for last Christmas," she said. For assuming I knew your story. For assuming anyone's story. I took the box but didn't open it. You didn't have to come here, I said gently. I know, she replied. That's why I did. Love hacked. She joined the next session a month later, not as the mother of my boyfriend, not as a woman from a wealthy suburb, but as someone trying to learn, trying to understand, trying to treat people with the respect they should have always received. And, oddly enough, I respected that, deeply. As winter settled again, and the world prepared for the next Christmas, I found myself sitting by my apartment window one snowy evening, watching tiny flakes drift down onto the quiet street below. Soft holiday music played from a neighbor's unit. Someone's dog barked joyfully from across the hall. I wrapped my hands around a warm mug and let the glow of my tiny Christmas tree fill the room. I realized then that the experiment I had started a year ago, walking into a wealthy family's home dressed like the simplest version of myself, had never really been about testing them. It had been about finding my way back to me. Back to my values. Back to the girl who grew up believing respect was earned by kindness, not by net worth. Back to the woman who now understood that real wealth was not the number of properties she owned, but the number of lives she could quietly, gently help shape. This year, under my small but loved Christmas tree, there were only a handful of gifts. None were expensive, none were wrapped in velvet or gold foil. But each one meant something, and I understood something, finally, fully. The richness of Christmas isn't measured by the gifts under the tree, but by how people treat you when they believe you have nothing to offer them. As I closed my eyes and let that truth settle, I imagined speaking directly to the people who would someday hear this story. Don't let anyone measure your worth by your paycheck, your outfit, or the assumptions they make when you walk into a room. Wealth doesn't define dignity. And dignity is the kind of wealth no one can take from you. A soft smile warmed my face as I lifted my mug. And if this story touched your heart, I would say gently, like this video, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments what makes you feel truly rich at Christmas, even if your bank account doesn't.